Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Lorgar's discovery, Lorgar's Betrayal in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Index **, Space Wolves. Origins. The 20 children of the Emperor of Mankind, the Primarchs, all landed on human worlds. Not all, though, were raised by humans. Mortarian's alien father is the most notable of these, of course, and several Primarchs were not adopted at all, Ferrus Manus and Conrad Kurz being the most clear-cut of these. Leman Russ, however, had a unique situation. When his pod, marked 6, landed on the soil of the freezing death world Fenris, he was not found by humans. Instead, a pack of wolves discovered the infant Primarch and adopted him as their own. Growing up with his 3 wolf brothers, Freaky, Jerry, and Hellier, though of course their true names sounded more like Howls, Leman became his pack's best hunter and leader. The other wolves found him a bit odd, of course, but given his importance and strength such things were not howled in public. Alas, such an idyllic childhood, for Fenris, could not last. After a few failed human hunts discovered the truth about the pack, the lords of the Russ tribe began hunting it with all possible force. Though 2 kings were killed on such hunts, eventually Leman, as well as Jerry and Hellier, Freaky having been killed during the battle, were brought before King Hfer of the Russ. It had taken the Russ half a century to capture Leman, Fenrisian wolves living longer than those of other worlds, and they mostly assumed that the Wolf King would be killed. Hfer, though, decided to instead try to re-educate Leman to be a member of Russ society. Despite his advanced age, Leman learned quickly and soon Hfer accepted him as a brother. Many, of course, were against such a ruling, including those who thought that Leman would obscure their own bid for the throne. Those people were wrong. Leman's upbringing had left him aloof and otherwise lonesome. He was aware of human society, but never made a true attempt to fully integrate himself into it. He was an observer, one of the most powerful fighters in the realm, yet one who rarely fought, save for practice. He had sworn oaths to the Russ and to his brother, and in war he led the Russ to many great victories, but in peacetime he merely watched the intrigues and debates. He lent his voice in matters that concerned him, such as war and crime, and his voice indeed carried considerable weight. It was said that Leman never lost a debate. These arguments, though, were rare. Leman's only moment of intervening in palace life was the coup attempt. It was recorded in imperial archives as an anti-Leman coup, though of course its intent was actually dethroning Hfer. Leman was approached for aid in the planning and even offered kingship, as a puppet, a massive mistake. Leman's first response was to kill the messengers, his second was to alert Hfer, and his third was to go on a rampage through the schemers' meeting. Leman's fury ended quickly, and as such he again receded into the background. Still, Hfer's reign remained secure, and after Hfer his son Hfain took the throne, aided by the unaging Leman. Leman had plenty of support for taking the throne, but personally refused. The time, though, was not far when Leman Russ would have to take command himself. The Great Crusade. The Emperor's arrival on Fenris almost triggered war. King Hfain did not take lightly to another receiving the title of sovereign over him. Leman's timely diplomacy helped ensure Fenris would remain mostly independent. In fact, the Imperium's rule over Fenris was effectively reduced to a guarantee that Fenris wouldn't side with the Emperor's enemies and Fenris' assignment as a home world for the 6 Legionia start of the Imperium. A number of these concessions were of course purely due to Leman Russ being present on Fenris and not any sort of diplomacy. The Emperor's reunion with his son was friendly, but not overly so. Russ would, it was clear, keep some distance from his father. He dethrones me and gives up the sovereignty of my realm, and then turns around and calls it a diplomatic victory. The arrogance of it all is astounding. He thinks he has the right, well, let him choke on it. King Hfain of the Russ. Russ meeting with his children, the 6th Legion, the Space Wolves, was initially similarly cordial, but Leman took command eagerly and soon integrated his force into the Fenrisian way. In fact, as Hfain was quite unhappy to learn, Leman now considered the Russ simply his heritage and took aspirants for the Legion from all tribes. Leman's happiness was tempered by learning his additional duty. It was a somber one, to eliminate those of the 20 Legions Asteroutes that betrayed their creator. The Emperor knew not all of his children would follow him willingly, after all. Of course, Rus could not execute other legions without the Emperor's express permission, and in fact his father hinted that he had prepared special measures in the case of the Space Wolves' own betrayal. It is likely that this was a bluff, or alternatively that the Emperor was referring to the Wulfen. In any case, the Space Wolves, Vilka Fenrika in their own language, quickly swelled their numbers. Rus kept his legion small, perhaps at 50,000 Asteroutes. He desired each Space Wolf to be powerful individually, as after all they might be facing other Asteroutes. The Wolf King kept his legion separate from others, he met little with his brothers, and had no great rivalries. He kept great working relationships with the legions he saw as similarly devoted, the Emperor's children, the Death Guard and, though he would come to regret it greatly, the Iron Warriors. Rus did not truly dislike any of his brothers, though there were a number of legions he worried about constantly, particularly the Word-bearers, for faith, World-eaters, for a feeling of wrongness, and Thousand Sons, for sorcery. Rus was careful to control his fears, though, trying never to fall into paranoia. Worlds conquered by the Space Wolves were largely left as they were. Indeed, the Space Wolves asked for nothing other than loyalty to the Emperor. Some claimed that this fostered rebellion, but in truth the Great Crusade saw nearly no such worlds revolt. Lorgar's betrayal, though, did cause a number of uprisings on worlds conquered by the Six, likely because Rus not knowing chaos prevented him from rooting out such cults, while other legions saw suspicious activity and stopped it, even without knowing the cause. The first instance where the Space Wolves used their power was the incident with the 2 and 11 legions. In fact, the Space Wolves eradicated these legions so completely that they have been erased from Imperial records, and only their numbers remain. The Vilka Fenrika themselves similarly remember, in sagas, only that Rus obliterated these forces, and for good reason. The surviving Primarchs have said nothing about these rebels. As the Great Crusade went on, Fenris itself stayed the same. Though Rus introduced some technology, for the most part he chose to keep the planet a place where warriors are born. This meant conflict, both with nature and between kingdoms. Hfain remained the ruler of several continents, but after his death the Rus splintered. They were the one tribe that Lehman gave the most technology to, but after a certain point he noticed that the new king Hfold had more technology than Lehman gave him, by far. The Rus still had a larger share than other tribes in the Vilka Fenrika, and Lehman journeyed down to his grandnephew to discuss this potential theft. Rus went alone, with only the Legion Jarl Joran Bloodhowl by his side. When he landed, he found himself surrounded by Rus guards armed with weapons most certainly stolen, as Hfold made a bid for dominion over Fenris. Joran took care of the guards, and Lehman killed Hfold with a single shot. The end of the Rus kingdom came soon after Hfold's end. The land therein was taken for the Fang, the Space Wolves' new fortress monastery. The people largely fled to other lands, or became Legion serfs, and, in some cases, Legion members. A few condemned Lehman as having betrayed his own people, but it was generally made clear that Hfold's rebellion left him no other choice. The Space Wolves stood for their lord unilaterally, and it was determined that the technology had been stolen through a serf spy. Despite all of this, Lehman made every effort to treat his former countrymen well, even pardoning most of Hfold's court. The fall of the Rus coincided with Lorgar's attack on his father. The Emperor consulted Rus on his opinion, but Rus trusted his father's judgment over his own. A number of records indicate that Lehman actually considered Lorgar's initial punishment too severe. As such, the Emperor made his famous compromise and allowed Lorgar to live, a decision which would soon be regretted. After all, Rus had long feared a rebellion that his legion would be unable to defeat by itself, yet even he could not have foreseen the maelstrom of the Great Betrayal. The Great Betrayal. Shortly before the Great Betrayal was announced to the galaxy, Perturabo contacted Rus, who at the time was in the Noctis Aract stars, a region isolated from much of the galaxy via warp interference despite being not too far from Terra. His face was twisted in fury, and, forwarding an order from the Emperor as proof, he informed Rus that a third legion had betrayed the Emperor, the 15. Lehman had doubted the Thousand Sons for a long time, and had in fact earlier suggested to Mort Arian that they be tried for their sorcery. The Dusk Prince had refused, but now the trusted Perturabo's information, as well as his clearly real anger, immediately caused the Wolf King to turn his fleet towards Prospero. Although he only informed a few of the Six as to what was going on, the Space Wolves arrived at Prospero in less than a month. The Legion was as a whole confused as to what they were doing visiting Magnus, especially as most Fenritians harbored a strong dislike of sorcery. In fact, the truth became popular gossip. The Primarch confirmed this as they came into orbit around the planet of the sorcerers. Magnus, as it happened, immediately contacted Russ. The Wolf King tried to fight it off, seeing it as a sign of corruption, but Magnus honestly asked a simple question. "Why are you here?" Russ cancelled the planned orbital bombardment in favor of a heavily defended non-psychic conversation with Magnus. In it, the Red Giant claimed total loyalty to the Emperor and insisted he was having gene seed problems. Confused, the Wolf King contacted Terra, where, after several days of failed contact attempts, he received cropped confirmation of what Magnus had said. The 15 was completely loyal to the Imperium. Perturabo's message had been expertly forged. The 6 remained in orbit around Prospero for months, as Lehman tried to understand the situation properly by contacting Perturabo. At last, after the deaths of 13 astropaths, Lehman received a message from Terra informing him that the Iron Warriors, along with 7 other legions, had risen up against the Imperium. Understanding that he had been close to bombarding Prospero on the word of a traitor, Lehman Russ profoundly apologized to Magnus and made for the location where he knew Perturabo would soon go, Terra itself. Russ looked at the planet below. It was a world of sorcerers, a world that Russ hated with all his hearts, and a world the Emperor had ordered ruined. Nevertheless, he did not have all the necessary details on the 15's treason, as he had for the 2 and 11. It was a split-second decision: would he fire the torpedoes then and there, or not? As his finger hovered over the button, Lehman thought back to his youth on Fenris. He had been taught, with not a little difficulty, to watch, to think before acting. This was not the wolf pack, this was society. Russ lifted his finger. Later. The warp transit was difficult, interrupted several times. Still, Prospero was not far from the throne world, and soon enough the Space Wolves arrived at Terra, only to find the traitors seemingly defeated. There were only 4 legions that had been thrown back from the walls of Terra, as opposed to the 8 total, and it was clear that half of their fleets had been delayed. The Wolf King nevertheless sent out a number of missions to destroy the betrayers' remnants. In space, the battle was quickly won, and on the surface searches discovered many of Lorgar's followers. The Iron Warriors were part of this first fleet, and they were hunted down with a particular ruthlessness. Unfortunately, none of the traitor Primarches were located, despite the Vilca Fenrica's best efforts. Perturabo's location was determined just as the second wave arrived at Terra. The bombardment and space battle were fierce, but in truth they didn't matter. The Iron Hands, Word-Bearers, Dark Angels, and World Eaters descended on Terra, rushing towards the Emperor's throne room. Before the Imperial Palace's siege began, though, the Space Wolves made an attack on Perturabo, Russ trying to assassinate the traitor who had been his brother. Many Space Wolves were killed in the hasty attack. The first to make it through Perturabo's defenses was Bjorn, but the Wolf Guard was struck down by the Iron Warrior's Primarch with 2 blows from his gauntlets. Next, the enraged Russ arrived at Perturabo's sanctum. The duel was long. After many strikes and counter-strikes, Perturabo's spear was broken in half by Russ, who followed through by stabbing the 4 Primarch 6 times. As Perturabo lay dying, his castle did likewise, collapsing onto itself. Lehman escaped the debris with Bjorn's body, which was soon interred in a dreadnought. Perturabo's body was found by Othir Wordmake, a rune priest, who brought Lehman Russ his fallen brother. The Battle of Perturabo's minefield cost the Vilca Fenrica dearly. For the death of 1,000 at least had fallen to the various fortifications. The mop-up provided by the Space Wolves after the first wave was invaluable to the garrisons of Terra, but it left the 6th greatly weakened for the second part of the battle as well. In sum, the Vilca Fenrica on Terra numbered perhaps 35,000 at the start of the Imperial Palace's siege. As the Dark Angel's siege engines pounded down the outer walls, as orbital bombardments devastated the surface of Terra, as the Iron Hands used long-forgotten catacombs to find passages to the throne room itself, Lehman Russ stood outside the palace. The Space Wolves were not made for siege warfare. Rather, they harassed the invaders, surging forth from secret camps below ruined cities. It was a difficult endeavor. Russ was a tactical genius, but so were his traitorous brothers. The greatest achievement during this time was the destruction of the Beast of Caliban, Lionel Johnson's favored Damon engine, by Russ. Claw after claw was ripped off of the monstrous beast, and after the beast was helpless, the Space Wolves' tanks pounded the monster into dust. The Dark Angel's counterattack was met with a retreat, though several, including Wordmake, fell in the chase. He stood with his arms raised, looking at the Dark Angel attackers. They had some of the most interesting machines he had ever seen, and their spirits were different. Others called them daemons, but a Wordmake was genuinely interested in what the lion had to offer. He suspected it was the lion ahead, in fact, the biggest figure in the vicinity, standing atop a tank. Then the giant fired, and a Wordmake was no more. Nevertheless, despite the Space Wolves' best efforts, the foundations of the Imperial Palace were breached. The World Eaters left at this point. Left with only 3 legions, Lorgar made the famous dash towards the throne room. The Space Wolves, meanwhile, continued their war with the Dark Angels on Terra's surface. The myriad battles watered Terra's soil with blood, slowing Lorgar's progress and distracting the Dark Angels from the siege, but at last the news came from the front that Lorgar had fallen. The traitors were by this point completely outnumbered, and as such both Ferris and the Lion made tactical retreats, fiercely pursued by most loyal legions. The 30,000 remaining Space Wolves watched the traitors flee Terra calmly. Russ told them to waste no great effort in chasing, the legion was too weak. Rather, the 6th Legion aided in reconstructing Terra, and after Guilliman's refusal to do so, Leman Russ lit Fulgrim's funeral pyre. The escape. The quiet didn't last long. After the Emperor's near corpse was entombed in the Golden Throne, Leman ordered the Space Wolves to leave Terra once again. The Vilka Fenrica were due to return to their home world of Fenris immediately, but bad conditions in the warp impeded their travel. On this return trip, Russ explained the future role of the Space Wolves to his children. The new Imperium would be much different from the old, and it was with some difficulty that Russ convinced Malkador, the Emperor's right-hand and effective heir, to allow the 6th a separate part. The Vilka Fenrica would still be executioners, rooting out the worst heretical threats to the Imperium. Simultaneously, they would remain observers, and Leman specifically gave up all command outside Fenris and the Space Wolves. Thirdly, they would stay warriors, the legendary sons of Fenris. After several years of difficult travel, the Space Wolves returned to their home. Leman Russ wanted to immediately start rebuilding his legion, but he felt something off as soon as he arrived. Descending onto Fenris' surface, he felt even more discord. His home world greeted him with open arms, but rumors flew of caverns filled with dark energy and of an attempt to corrupt Fenris itself. After a few weeks of searching, Russ rune priests found the source of the disturbance. It was a great cavern beneath the Gufbra Ocean, into which Russ sent several warriors. They were met with gunshots, and Russ descended to yet again wage warfare on his homeworld's surface for what he hoped was the last time. The land below was a Dark Angel's outpost, worked by 1,000,000 slaves. These had once been human, but had since mutated beyond recognition. Their masters were few in number, but had a large number of huge machinery, most utterly tainted with chaos. It did not take long for Russ to smash apart the Dark Angels, which were outnumbered and outgunned, but their biggest machine resisted destruction. It was identified as a daemon device, but none knew what it did. Eventually, Russ entered the machine's inner workings. The daemon tempted him then, but Russ easily smashed aside those ideas, his loyalty was greater. Then, the daemon taunted him with the true purpose of the device, to corrupt the planetary psyche of Fenris, tainting it and eventually turning it into a daemon world. I refuse your offer. My father created this Imperium to defend mankind from the likes of you. He created me and my brothers to defend mankind from the likes of you. He created this monolith, this modern universe to protect us. You resorted to scheming, to lying, and still you couldn't destroy it. You are pathetic, you have sacrificed morality for strength, and lost both. I refuse your offer. As would anyone, from this point forth. Leman Russ. Russ' Space Wolves besieged the fortress time and time again, failing each time. At last, Leman released a horror from beneath the rock. They were known as the Wolfen, mutated Space Wolves that were furred and feral, but completely resistant to chaos. It was the Wolfen that brought down the Corruptor, as it became known, tearing it apart with unseen strength. Eventually, Russ ripped the monster's cannon off, along with about a third of its body. It was then that the Corruptor fell silent at last. In vengeance for the attempted capture of Fenris, and re-establishing contact with the Imperium, Russ sent a great company, led by Jarl Varl Redblade, to Caliban, as it had not yet been declared destroyed by the other legions. In truth, though, the world turned out to be merely rocks floating in space by the time the Space Wolves arrived. The Long War. Over the millennia, the sagas surrounding Russ and Bjorn have grown to incredible proportions. Indeed, in all of the Imperium there is probably no pair of warriors more famed than these two. Both have grown more powerful with time, both in skill and, in Bjorn's case, in mechanical augmentations, and though of course neither spends close to all of their time in battle, they, unlike the other surviving Primarchs and some of the other surviving Dreadnoughts, have stayed fighters first. Indeed, it is no accident that the two have so many tales of miraculous survivals. The Space Wolves have had to deal with an astounding number of invasions of Fenris over time. The most worrying of these was the Battle of the Fang in M32, an attack by the Iron Hands. The Tiantian Asteroids hacked into the orbital codes and disguised their ships, allowing them to safely land before their treachery was announced. Led by Ferrus Manus himself, the Iron Hands came at a time when Russ was away from Fenris with most of the Legion, leaving Bjorn to head the defense while outnumbered and dealing with the Psychic Legion. Nevertheless, the Dreadnought stopped several of Ferrus' incursions before Magnus the Red arrived with several fellowships. The Red Giant had foreseen the attack, and easily made it to Fenris. The Iron Hands were driven back, but Ferrus made a final attack on the Sixth's fortress monastery itself, the Fang. The traitor Marines managed to get inside quickly, but Ferrus' advance was met by Bjorn and the 50 other Wolf Guard that had remained on Fenris, who defeated the Daemon Prince in single combat and banished him to the warp for 1,000 years. Meanwhile, Magnus broke apart the rest of the invasion, and the Iron Hands fled in disgrace. These attacks on their home world do not indicate that the Space Wolves are weak. On the contrary, the Vielka Fenrika have been among the most active legions. From Sentius Prime to Magdalene, the Sixth has protected the Imperium in countless battles. Over time, they have become more and more independent from the Imperium at large, and their hunts have earned both fear and love from civilians, love for their protection and heroism, and fear, as in children's stories, for their impersonal destruction. Russ and Magnus have healed their rifts in the years since the betrayal, and indeed they are the closest that a legion has come to becoming true friends of the Space Wolves. Indeed, even their genetic instability is similar. Curing the flesh change took a huge toll on the Thousand Sons, though, and Russ did not want his legion to pay the price for unsafe experimentation. The most recent great battle of the Space Wolves was the confrontation on Garm. On this planet, Russ had long before left his spear. Unfortunately, after millennia cults had appeared, some worshipping Russ as a god and some worshipping chaos. The Space Wolves, led by Russ himself, came to Garm to stomp out the chaos cults. By the time they arrived, the planet was embroiled in a massive civil war over the spear, the chaotic side being assisted by hordes of daemons. Eventually, the young Ragnar Blackmane found the lost artifact and returned it to Russ, who returned it to Fenris after the war was over. Garm was reintroduced to the Imperial truth, Russ ensuring that the cults surrounding him were treated relatively well but taught their mistakes. Thus, from the betrayal to today, the Space Wolves have remained that which Leman Russ made them, fearless, if ruthless, warriors. Organization. The Space Wolves are subdivided into 12 great companies. These nominally consist of 4,000 asteroids each, and each is led by a so-called Wolf Lord. About 1,000 Marines are not linked to any single company. These are known as lone wolves, wolves that are the last survivor of their squad. They fulfill scout roles on the battlefield. A great company is subdivided into squads, typically consisting of about 5 Marines. These do not receive reinforcements, a squad is recruited simultaneously, and loses members with time until it dwindles to a single lone wolf. The squad also receives promotions simultaneously. The starting level is that of a Blood Claw, progressing to a Grey Hunter and then a Long Fang. Each of those 3 groups is found in similar numbers within a company. Wolf Priests and Rune Priests are the 2 types of specialists in the Legion. Wolf priests fulfill the role of apothecary, while rune priests are similar to librarians. They are considered the purest type of psyker in the Imperium, as they draw their power filtered from Fenris itself, though when Fenris was polluted by the corruptor, it was demonstrated even rune priests were not immune to chaos. In general, both types of priests make up about 5% of the legion. Thus, in an average company, there will be about 1,200 blood claws, grey hunters, and long fangs, as well as about 200 wolf and rune priests. Specialists are removed from their squads. The highest rank that most space wolves can achieve is that of Wolf Guard. These are 100 Terminator armored veterans that serve as the bodyguards of Leman Russ and the defenders of Fenris. They are considered to be the greatest warriors of the space wolves, and are not divided into squads. Often, dozens of them will be deployed at once, led by Leman Russ or Bjorn the Fell-Handed. Such an assault can break almost any enemy. Dreadnoughts are not common in the space wolves, with perhaps 10 per great company. Nevertheless, the ancients that are present are regarded very highly and often live for millennia. Bjorn the Fell-Handed is the greatest of these. He has survived since the Great Betrayal, and serves as the leader of the Wolf Guard. The book recounting his exploits is almost as long as that of Leman Russ himself. His current sarcophagus, used since a few centuries after the heresy when his first was damaged, nearly killing Bjorn, was one of the first dreadnoughts built using Coryx's eternal pattern. This new design almost entirely eliminated dreadnought degeneration, allowing Bjorn to not spend 90% of his time asleep. Each great company is led by a great wolf, who has total control over his forces. The leader of the entire legion is of course Leman Russ, and the Primarch heads it as well as any possibly could. Combat Doctrine. The Vilka Fenrika's arrival is typically preceded by orbital bombardment, though, of course, only on Xeno and Chaos worlds. When the legion does land, their goal is the utter destruction of the foe. They give no mercy, and often hives in which the wolves fight will become riddled with holes in the areas of Chaos cults or hiding Xeno's former locations. The space wolves rarely use many vehicles, as their belief is that every battle brother should be able to run when necessary. Nevertheless, each marine is given their own choice of weapon, and both close combat and ranged brothers are common. This choice does not affect squad allegiance, and thus space wolf squads will be mixed. It takes evidence to convince the space wolves to come to a world, but when they do they come in force. Hundreds of drop pods drop from the sky, and upon landing they open to reveal howling wolves. The area is then cleansed of threats by sheer force. Often, the space wolves leader will search for the enemy's head and duel them, sometimes a suicidal maneuver, but when a wolf does go down this way, he makes sure that others are able to finish the monster off. Against their toughest challenges, the space wolves may use the Wolfen. Several thousand of these beasts languish in the woods around the Fang and under the fortress. They were once Astaroths themselves, but have since lost their intellect, or at least their sanity, and become like animals. To become one is considered the worst fate a space wolf can suffer, and one feeling the onset of the curse will often seek a glorious death in battle, though the curse is rare, and appears much more often in young space wolves. Nevertheless, the Wolfen are extremely strong, and resistant to chaos. In fact, they have an anti-psychic effect. When they rampage across the battlefield, none will be spared. Homeworld. The homeworld of the space wolves is oft-threatened Fenris. It is a death world, full of freezing tundras and unstable terrain. Other than the freezing temperature, Fenris is notable for the various monsters that roam its seas and land. Among those are the great wolves, the serpents, the mammoths, and the krakens. Some of those might be Xeno species and others modified during the dark age of technology, but their genetic history is muddled. As time has went on, Leman Russ has introduced some new technology to Fenris, but to ensure his people remain fighters he has hired Mechanicum agents to tinker with the monsters in order to make them stronger. Moreover, Russ ensures that his homeworld's tribes remain disunited and often at war with one another to ensure, again, their strength. As such, Fenris has retained much of its older culture, one of heroism and struggle. It is notable that the Mechanicum's tinkering has had interesting effects on the krakens, and in fact the great cephalopods have now created weapons of their own. Contact has not so far been made, but if they turn out to be hostile, massive issues will erupt. I have not been preserved across the millennia to stay the same, and neither has the Imperium. The Krakens may be odd, they may be xeno, they may be monsters, but they are not evil. I see much of myself in this young race. Tell them, I accept the negotiations. If necessary, we will fight together. If necessary, we will build a spaceship to raise them off Fenris. Humanity is not alone in the stars, and it needs to stop pretending that it is. Bjorn the Fell-Handed. Fenris has been assaulted by chaos quite often over the millennia. Thus, its defenses are quite spectacular, 4 giant battle stations that can see any point around the planet, as well as the impregnable fortress of the Fang, its current mass constructed in M37 with the help of the Ultramarines. This is, of course, on top of the formidable natural challenge that Fenris is to invading armies. Beliefs. The Space Wolves follow the doctrine of the Imperial Truth, believing in a secular Imperium. Beyond that, though, their beliefs vary significantly from those of other Loyalist legions. In their biggest deviation, they agree with the traditional beliefs of Fenris, seeing nature, especially that of their home world, as sacred. Such minor issues are admitted by Russ as detrimental to the Vilka Fenrika's relationship with much of the Imperium, but Russ holds on to them nevertheless, as long as they do not violate the tenets of the truth. The Space Wolves also have an interesting view of their own role. They believe they were created as the Emperor's executioners against those who betrayed him. Some Imperial historians have doubted this idea's truth, but regardless, the Space Wolves live by it. Gene Seed. The Space Wolves' gene seed is quite impure for a Loyalist legion. For one, the curse of the Wolfen, though rare, is a constant danger. In general, though, the gene seed gives improved senses, a state which Russ calls communion with the inner wolf, at the expense of gaining some predatory instincts. Fortunately, Russ' presence has kept the situation relatively stable. It is unknown how bad matters would be if he were gone. Battle Cry. The most common Space Wolves battle cry has changed over the millennia, and only Russ and Bjorn know where it started off, but currently its form has stabilized, for Russ and the Emperor. 999.M41. Leman Russ groaned, massaging the place where the orc had hit him hardest. At first, he had thought the World Eaters had corralled Wa'ayik Gazgul towards Armageddon simply to hurt an important hive world. That was certainly within the limits of how they operated. But it had been more than that, hadn't it? It had been a warning. Gazgul Maduruk Thrika was an orc war boss strong enough to take on a Primarch and barely lose. That, in itself, marked him as the most powerful war boss since the Great Crusade. More than that, though, he had been smart enough to know he would likely lose, and prepare measures accordingly. Thrika had been cunning enough to escape with his reputation among the orcs intact, no easy feat, after losing a duel. They had neglected the orcs for too long. They had let the Green Plague fester, chosen to continue to let it spill Imperial blood, so long as it was half contained. Well, it was contained no more. The orcs were back, with might unseen not merely since the time of the Beast, but since the wars of Goro and Olaner. And, Leman Russ suspected, might unseen even before then. For this was a warrior with both strength and cunning, but also a message of faith. This was a war boss who could unify the orcs. And more than that, Russ suspected, this was a war boss who would succeed in exactly that. Check the description for the links to the author.